Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Two Cities podcast. I'm your host, Theo Howard, and today it is Shrove Tuesday, the last day before the season of Lent, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Mr. Andrew Thornton-Norris. Mr. Thornton-Norris, welcome to the Two Cities podcast.
Thank you, Mr. Howard. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, for those of our audience who might not be familiar with Mr. Thornton-Norris and his works, he is an accomplished poet who has been praised by such authors as David Yezzie, Fiona Sampson, Alison Brackenbury, John Powell Ward, the Dominican Father Aidan Nichols, and the late Sir Roger Scruton. He is the author of a very fine work which has recently been republished in a second edition by Oz Press, and that's going to be the subject of our conversation today. The work is The Spiritual History of English, and I'll just read a little bit of the blurb to give our audience a condensed summary. The blurb reads, "In an ambitious critique ranging over 1,500 years of literary history, the poet Andrew Thornton-Norris argues that the demise of English literature reveals the heavy cost of rejecting objective moral standards and sacred realities. Only the Catholic faith has power to prevail against the dictatorship of relativism in all its erosive manifestations, and to provide once again those underlying norms of mind, behaviour and workmanship on which civilization thrives. The Anglophone world will experience cultural rebirth when it embraces anew the divine religion it has tried to bury in successive waves of revolution." End quote. I've been very interested and illuminated, edified in reading your work, Mr. Thornton-Norris, recently, and it struck me that it reminded me of Dr. John Senior's work, The Decline of Christian Culture, and a little bit of his successive work to that, The Restoration of Christian Culture, but particularly focused on our own native home of England, in focusing on the, as you put it, the incarnation of belief in the language and literature of a people. So I understand that after studying PPE, philosophy, politics and economics, focused on philosophy and politics at Oxford University, you wanted to write, but in your own words, you realized that English Romantic literature was no longer possible. Could you maybe start by elaborating on that a little for our audience?
Yeah, so it's worth pointing out that in relation to the rest of your series, that I came to matters of religion and faith through culture and literature, having been brought up in a secular environment and education, etc. And really, for me, the only glimpses beyond that were, in particular, Gerard Manley Hopkins, which was on my A-level syllabus. I had an interest in writing. That was my, the thing I was interested in, my kind of passion. And I was looking for models and for things to copy, or for people to read in order to understand how to go about it. And frankly, found it very difficult. In fact, I only really gained confidence in a subject, if you like, when much later I found the Catholic faith and the immense resources of subject matter, what is poetic subject matter, which, from the Bible and from tradition and the spiritual mystical works. So really, at the book was an attempt to examine the current writers at the time. There were poets like Philip Larkin, Ted Hughes. These were the kind of big names around when I was younger, successful poets. You have, people like Simon Armitage today, and they never there always seemed to be a limit to what their subject matter could deal with, and it never seemed to me to go as deep as Hopkins had. Now, I knew very little about Catholicism or even Christianity, just some basics. But there seemed to be something in it which was very attractive, and which I didn't find in these other authors. And I think also in kind of technical terms, the prevalence of free verse and in particular, the rejection of meter. Shakespeare is written in blank verse mainly, and especially through T.S. Eliot and others. Poets seem to have given up, apart from Larkin, of course, but there's the split between Larkin and Hughes, for example. And so there was the question of, why had these things been given up, and what effect had they had, and what was available or possible to sustain literary standards in terms of technique, and also in terms of models, historical models, because in the kind of cultural situation we're in, the tendency is to reject standards and to completely give the liberty to the individual to do whatever they like. And I think that the cultural establishment as it exists is very negative about forms of verse and historical models, etc., which are traditional. But having said that, I think it's important that if somebody writes, it has to be contemporary as well. So it's not. I don't mean traditional in a complete sense, but just some of the standards and some of the techniques and some of the models and some of the ideas, especially the spiritual, mystical, religious ideas, which make for the greatest poetry, I think.
Yes, in his foreword that David Clayton writes in your second edition, he says that you show us that even if a poet or novelist is sincerely Catholic today and trying to express truths that are consistent with the faith, he is at a great disadvantage if he is seeking to express those truths with vocabulary and poetic forms that reflect a post-Enlightenment culture.
Yeah.
And you examine modernity in this particular version of it, England and its literature.
Yeah.
Following this striking argument that I entirely concur with, that in a certain sense, modernity is the unfolding of the Protestant heresy. So in the first part of your book, you describe the debt that English identity has to the Catholic faith. And this is a subject that's very dear to my heart, almost the papal creation of England itself. Yeah. And you explore how that is expressed in the origins of the English language. And one of the areas you describe, which I think is very pertinent, with regard to England as the world's oldest continually functioning state, English is also its most widely spoken language. There's a connection here. This is something that I've discussed before with regard to the English soul, its distinctly practical application. And we can see how King Alfred began his law book with a translation of the law given to Moses in the book of Exodus and a description of how this had been changed by Christianity. Then you say very wonderfully, thus the English tradition of liberty began with liberation from sin. Early English as it began to form. How would you outline the importance of the faith and England's place within the universal church to this development?
It's an interesting counterpoint between the island of England in particular and the rest of the continent and the faith. I think clearly, if you consider the extent of the Roman Empire and within the British Isles, certainly the faith penetrated in the same way that the Roman Empire had right across. It's argued that the very name of England itself comes from the Pope saying not angles but angels, and whereas the Saxons were the main, the more powerful element within the Germanic invaders. But you see, I think there's this the very interesting theme which runs through the book and through English history, and you have important heresies which originate here, Pelagius, and later in particular around William of Ockham, the beginning of nominalism, which begins in France a bit earlier, really. But these themes which are very antagonistic to Catholic orthodoxy, and so I think there's this tension which as you mentioned, develops later on as and into Protestantism and a lot of secularism, which originates here in a more probably, as you say, in a more pragmatic form than it does in France. It's maybe more intellectual in France, but develops here as in industrialization and a purely secular way of life. So those themes are there throughout, and it's also there in terms of literary history, as I kind of mentioned previously, that you see it particularly in T.S. Eliot, this tension between Romanticism and Classicism, which is hinting back to what I was talking about before, which is how you maintain objective standards and, a literary canon, and how that's offset or challenged by, if you like, a more subjective romantic approach, which might emphasize, particular creativity at a particular time. That tension between those two different sets of values, which is often, observed within literary history and literary criticism, which are some of the themes which I develop in the book. So, why England becomes so Protestant so quickly is obviously to do with the nature of the state and Henry's actions. And then you have this very interesting little event afterwards of the Elizabethan period and this incredible flourishing of Shakespeare and the Elizabethan stage, which is almost a response to that and a summing up of and a representation of the Middle Ages on the stage. And I think Chaucer really is the high point of medieval English Catholic literature, and I think that we can start there as our kind of that's the perfect embodiment of English Catholic storytelling, way of life, and literature as well.
Yes, it's a manifestation of the organic development of, by that point, Middle English, which concurrently has become the vernacular language of the entire population. Although the nobility and king would also speak French, the bifurcation that you had earlier in the Middle Ages of an English-speaking commons and a French-speaking elite is starting to close.
Yeah.
Something actually I heard about Chaucer Middle English recently. Perhaps you'd be able to clarify this. Was that in Middle English there is no word for alone or lonely?
I haven't heard that.
Which would seem to reflect something of the medieval society and culture, that it was such a corporate social epoch, and aloneness is basically a condition of modernity, and the novel is an art form which speaks to that, and that's something we can come back to. But as I alluded at the beginning of our discussion, one of the prominent themes that you seem to have contended with in your intellectual life is the tradition of Protestant Romantic literature, which itself might be characterized as an expression of nationalism.
Yeah.
And it's artificial. And one thing you point out in your work, Spiritual History of English, is how one of the, as it is an artificial ideology, nationalism, it reconstructs the past in order to suit its own political priorities. So, for instance, it claims that there was always this autonomous vernacular of the English language. But as you point out in your early chapters, that actually English literature began in Latin, and that paganism of the classical authors was the staple of the medieval liberal education. The Anglo-Saxon culture enabled Charlemagne to lay the foundations for the emergence of French as the first vernacular literature. In Provence, the Celtic and Germanic traditions of the north met those of the Latin south. Italian emerged from the influence of the troubadours in Provence, which Dante later transformed from its Albigensian heretical form into orthodoxy.
Yeah.
And so it's amazing how the European linguistic stories are all interwoven, and England is very much, or English is right at the heart of that.
Absolutely, and it's going back to what I was saying before, and recent political events. England was a completely integrated part of the Latin medieval culture, and even as you say, learning was reintroduced into continental Europe by Alcuin in the court of Charlemagne after the period of destruction, the Dark Ages, they call it, after the Roman Empire. And that came from England, and it was monastic, and it came from, the Celtic monasteries and from Northumberland. So absolutely, and again, that's kind of an element, a theme which I bring forward. And to today, as you say, when we're reflecting on this today. And although there's so much around which is hostile to these thoughts and these ideas, you only need to go into medieval churches and to look at medieval villages or towns, cathedrals, to rediscover a sense of that continuity. And in literary terms, you have the whole tradition of Latin literature, which forms the foundation and is then, as you say, translated into the vernaculars. There's a very famous book about it, which shows how the techniques of rhetoric are transmitted from the classical world through Latin in the Middle Ages and into the vernacular literatures. And in that sense, I think this is one of the problems with a lot of kind of modern approaches to literature, is they because they don't have the resources of those deep roots. People often think they're doing something new, which has actually been done 3,000 years ago. In that sense, I think we're certainly losing something if we don't have a sense of the connection of what we're doing with the past. And as obviously the book is one attempt to try and rediscover some of that.
One of the comparisons that you draw, which is very interesting, is that between Dante and Chaucer as two disciples of this literary tradition. And just to take one example, you discuss how Dante took the romantic understanding of courtly love derived from the Provençal and Catholicized it, made it orthodox as a part of medieval Christian rather than pagan Latin classical culture. Of course, it is Beatrice who is Dante's guide in the Divine Comedies. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the work of the contemporary scholar Dr. Joseph Bottom.
Yeah.
Who teaches at Notre Dame, as our American brothers and sisters call it. His book, The Decline of the Novel, is very interesting because he claims that the novel as an art form is essentially Protestant. That while the first novel, Don Quixote, was Catholic, the form develops as the art form of the modern Protestant West. And he argues that it was to reveal the, quote, thick self in a thin universe, end quote, driven by a Protestantism of the air. He says, quote, "The modern novel came into being to present the Protestant story of the individual soul as it strove to understand its salvation and achieve its sanctification, illustrated by the parallel journey of the new style characters with their well-finished interiors as they wandered through their adventure in the exterior world." End quote. Seems that your own history, spiritual history of English, is quite sympathetic to that view.
Yeah, I think so. Again, going back to what we were saying before, there's a tension and there's an interesting development in the Middle Ages, particularly, for example, in the place of women in society. I think it's clear that certainly women are given more agency and a role in society in a way that in previous cultures they were possessions. I think that's, some of that is clear in the way that the Catholic Church develops rules around who can marry and who can't marry, breaking down this the tribal approach to marriage and having it as a means of a political means, effectively, albeit on a smaller scale. So I think that actually, going back to a talk you gave about the development of Parliament out of the Dominican order, the governing structure of the Dominican order, you were talking about, the various theses around whether this was a unique thing in England coming out of the Dominican order, or whether similar structures had developed in Spain, I think, possibly related to the Dominicans as well. I think this idea of individual liberty, as well as the individual, does develop in the Middle Ages. And I think that a lot of the problems that we have once that's removed from its Catholic context and put into and secularized, then you get some of the problems that you get with liberalism. You get your cultural problems alongside it, with relativism in the arts and all the various things we talk about there. But I do think that this is, again, coming from a Christian principle, which is individual free will. And you notice that, and in fact, interestingly, Rachel Fulton Brown talks about, this development at the turn of the millennium as well. Prior to the millennium, everybody had been preparing for the end of the world. And then, this is possibly one of the reasons why, in the 11th and 12th centuries, you start to get, this re-flourishing and development of Christian culture. And some of these ideas, so the romances in literature, and underlying it, and then underlying lots of the ideas in philosophy as well, is this tension between authority and the individual. And I think that, as you say, is supercharged at the Reformation, because what happens is that the individual usurps religious authority. So the individual becomes their own pope, effectively, and they read scriptures and take what they want from tradition, and then obviously that has enormous cultural consequences, as you say. I haven't read that book, but it's well known and established that the novel is pretty much a Protestant form, which again is interesting. In the 20th century, you get some very significant Catholic novel writers, Graham Greene and Evelyn Waugh in particular.
Yeah, something that John Senior points out as well, that the greats of English literature are largely Protestant, and so they are limited. And of course, in Spanish or French literature, it's a different story, but English literature can only sort of go so far, really, without having Eucharistic themes, Marian themes, ecclesial themes, all these particularly Catholic themes. And so for Joseph Bottom, this leads to the decline of the novel, which we're seeing at the moment. He says, "No one feels bad anymore for not reading novels. They are no longer works of great public, moral, or political significance." He talks about the cocktail party test, referring to a gathering, a party of writers and intellectuals where 20, 30 years ago, the latest new novels would be discuss where you would be embarrassed not to have read certain
Yeah.
new novels, whereas now the latest Netflix show probably occupies the cultural space once dominated by the novel. He says the novel is dying, if not dead. Fiction is no longer a useful means of grappling with reality. Yes, this is something that's very much a prominent theme in your own work here. This crisis of the self, and similarly, how you trace the disintegration, or to the last half of the 20th century, when Protestantism began failing throughout the West. Yes, you identify the 1960s as a critical cultural watershed, as a paradigm shift when romantic Protestant identity, religion gets supplanted by something else, which is much harder to define. I've struggled to define it as well, and I really want to, but because it is an identity of based on negation, which shows you how evil it is, it's difficult to do. But what do you mean by, if we reflect on that sort of Protestant romantic ethos, how would you sketch that to people, the core identity of certainly of England in the, let's say, 18th, 19th, early 20th centuries?
Yeah, again, I think I mean I really see Romanticism as the literary tendency, which is the counterpart of Protestantism. Now, these are very broad generalizations, and I'd get myself in trouble if I was in an English course or something. But I really see it as the, if you like, the literary authority is the self, and also the immediate time, and classicism being the contrary, being something which looks back to historical standards and the techniques of rhetoric, for example. Of course, the whole cultural milieu of church and the ancient world. But something I talk about, which I don't know if anybody else does, is that I think the natural development from religious authority in the Catholic Church, specifically the authority of tradition, the deposit of faith being passed down from the apostles, and that being the job of the hierarchy. Once you get into Protestantism, you get umpteen varieties of Christianity. And then I think the next step is that you get many varieties of alternative faiths. People make up their own faiths, and the way I see Romanticism is that art itself becomes a religion, and so people and you see this in other fields as well. People may have a belief in social justice, for example, or humanitarianism, or other political causes take the place of faith. The environment is an obvious one, and I kind of see Romanticism as being that, turning art or literature into a religion. And I think that creates a lot of problems because, you see it in Wordsworth. A lot of his early poetry is about him wanting to write and to be a great writer and this type of thing. What comes alongside, in particular, Orthodox Catholicism, is a complete moral system, and to some extent a philosophical system, as well as a set of religious beliefs, which answers and addresses all kinds of questions which romantic poetry and, I don't know, modern art, the grand statements or conceptual statements of modern art, they may be impressive in certain senses, but they don't really do anything. They might make money, but they don't have the kind of moral and spiritual context which previous forms of art and literature had.
Yes, that are in a certain sense pointing to the sources of life. I mean, money itself is lifeless. It's just, yeah. Especially fiat currency, is just completely representative of nothing other than the value, the faith that we put into it. But the 19th century Romanticism does seem to have its sort of Janus faced. It has different currents within it. Part of it is very Catholic.
Yeah.
Especially in France, the response to the French Revolution, Chateaubriand,
Yeah.
and the continental romanticists in Germany as well, where this literary sensibility was attached to a political vision and an admiration for the Middle Ages and a recovery of the sense of affectivity,
Yeah.
putting reason in its right place. But on the other hand, as you say, there was also streams of romanticism which involved the divinization of nature, this self-referential heroic self. So it's a very interesting movement because the 19th century has this Catholic breath,
Yeah.
but it's not comprehensive in the way that the Counter-Reformation was.
No, the Baroque is, yeah,
Baroque.
obviously a Catholic movement, and it's very interesting. I think of Pugin and the Gothic revival in architecture, but you see, I admire artists who are able to provide an alternative to prevailing culture that we live in, and that's for me. Hopkins is my the model for that. But you get that in Pugin in architecture, for example. But as a whole, the movement, kind of what we would think of as romantic, the hard foundations of society are moving towards war and human rights as a kind of alternative belief system to Christianity. The march is very much there, and of course then the modernists intervene and complain about those aspects of romanticism which are frivolous and weak, if you like, and replace them with hard brutalist architectural and kind of poetic terms and musical terms as well, to some extent reflecting the new values of society. It's a pretty bleak picture when you get into the 20th century, and again, you have to admire people like Eliot, for example, who attempted to some extent to A, understand the situation, and B, to provide to write and to create originally. And I think he did achieve great things. But interestingly, I don't know if you ever read The Lamp. A.N. Wilson, the English writer, reported in there that he'd spoken to Eliot's widow. I think he reported after she died, and he said, because Eliot's an interesting figure, because he poetic hero is Dante, and he's very much aware of these themes. But he reported his widow saying that Eliot would rather have been a Buddhist than a Catholic, and I think there's some of that as well in John Senior's book as well, where he talks about Eliot. He identifies, as you described earlier, the nihilistic element in it, and I think that's, again, going back to the ideas of the self, things which are self-referential. And that's why, for me, it's such a relief to come into a culture which is connected to the whole of the Western tradition, and is integrated into it. And in that sense, it has so much life, so much living within it that seems destroyed elsewhere. And you're talking about Netflix and the latest novels and this type of thing. I mean, that sums it up, really. That's where we are. And even when I was a child and I was at school, there were novels. I suppose Michel Houellebecq is probably the only novelist who people would say, "Oh, have you read the latest Houellebecq?" But it's really that, and our society is so advanced in many ways, and so technologically extraordinary, and our way of life is so. We have so many conveniences, but we have this massive cultural desert as the counterpart to it, and that was really what set me off on the path of saying, okay, so why is this happening, and what's the solution?
It strikes me the T.S. Eliot's prejudice there
Mm.
against the true faith. It reminds me of C.S. Lewis, who Tolkien said was loath to convert because he had ulterior motives, and this basically idol of nationalism, this loyalty to the nation state, as sort of romantically constructed, was just this too great an obstacle
Yeah.
to final giving of oneself to the church and being inducted into that great tradition, that unbroken tradition, as you say. So you conclude your work, Miss Thornton-Norris, by saying that English literature has declined almost to the point of non-existence, and what remains are the entrails or shipwrecks, so to speak. Now, I particularly valued, I have to say, your final chapter on postmodernism and the conclusion, because you identify several hopeful signs. And I think that we are, as you say, in this cultural desert, clearly. But there are signs that in that aridity, there are perhaps the very earliest springs of life. For instance, you point to something very interesting. So if you'll permit me just to quote you here, you say, quote, mass immigration has been the counterpart to the decline of Protestantism in England and the romantic Protestant form of English or British identity, which accompanied imperialism, as lamented by Philip Larkin and Enoch Powell, among others. The very presence of so many immigrants in England with their very different religions and cultures poses a fundamental challenge to this romantic Protestant worldview. It encourages the kind of meditation on a deeper understanding of English, European, and indeed Christian identity, which embraces the first 1,000 years of its history rather than just the last 500. As Peter Ackroyd expounds at length, English culture and identity has always been a counterpoint of cosmopolitanism and introversion, founded on a secure religious identity. It is the absence of the latter which has made the period after the Second World War unusual. The demise of the romantic Protestant version of the chosen people narrative and its replacement with a libertarian, relativist, neo-pagan individualism. End quote. Immigration is an issue, as they put it, which is incessantly in the political discourse or the sort of regime permitted political discourse at the moment. I think there are all sorts of reasons for that we don't need to get into, but suffice to say, I think it's helpful for power holders to direct people's concerns towards the other rather than towards examining their own spiritual state. And that's not to say that I embrace mass migration either. It functions as a sort of safety valve issue as well. But you're pointing here to sort of a providential consequence of it, which I think is very true in that it's incredible how the British Empire, which if you travel around the world is still seen as such a part of Britain's identity, is largely forgotten in
Yeah.
England itself, so that younger people in particular find themselves looking for the sources of English identity
Yeah.
and increasingly find the true faith and are converting in large numbers. And it is precisely the contrast of all these different cultures invading Albion that prompts that reflection.
And you said it before, it was a constructed identity, and in many ways began really with Henry and then Elizabeth, and has persisted throughout as a form of statecraft. And it's interesting, because I think I quote Plato in the book, because culture really is downstream from politics, and politics is downstream from theology. Your political principles and your moral principles, and then that's how the society exists. It's how the society is created, and artists, creative people live within that culture. Okay, there's some feedback, and the criticism might affect, or identification of good or bad elements may then feed back into the way that theologians or their equivalent or politicians think about society. And Peter Ackroyd's interesting because he identified what he calls the mongrel character of England. So and it's very clear from our history, with the Celtic element, the Germanic, the Normans, that certainly in the very early period there was a mixing of different cultures, obviously all Northern European cultures, but or with a bit of a Roman element as well. He argues in Albion that that's one of the reasons why England has adapted so well to mass immigration. But you're right, that ideology was the ideology which sustained the empire. You hear people talking before the Second World War and certainly in the 19th century about about Catholic things, and they mean Catholicism, Catholic elements within the Church of England, because it's just unthinkable that people would be Roman Catholics. That's really gone, I think. And as you say, I think a lot of the ground has been cleared for people intellectually, and frankly, given some of the things we've spoken about before, there's an element of despair. What else is there? We are in a pretty difficult state, and so I think it's a very positive sign that young people are able to think for themselves and to re-examine these things. We live in interesting times, as the Chinese say.
Mm. Yeah, the best of times for our souls.
Yes, indeed.
To be sanctified by God's grace. And of course, Christ says to St. Paul that my grace is sufficient for thee, and my power is made perfect in weakness, which doesn't just take place the microcosmic level of the individual soul, but also at the corporate level of societies, because of course societies are just collections of souls belonging to families. And I mean, I was just thinking the other day about how could there possibly be a better atmosphere for the future explosion of vocations in contemplative orders and the revival of monasticism than the incessant bombardment of smartphone notifications and this constant spiritual agitation they experience. I mean, I just long, in a certain sense, to just go to a monastery. And it seems that in that experience, God is tilling the soil for this revival of monasticism, because it will only get to a certain point that is so alienating to the human spirit that the only escape will be contemplative life. And that's how Christendom was built in the first place, by the monks translating the great works of the classical world as well as the Christian texts. I wonder if you are familiar with a famous interview of Jorge Luis Borges with William Buckley, where he describes why he believes that English is a far finer language than Spanish. And he says that basically English is unique in that it is both a Germanic and a Latin language, that it has these two registers. So you can say something in two different ways, which have slightly different semantic connotations. So you could say regal and kingly, which have the same definition, but we know as native English speakers, they have a slightly different inflection. You can say fraternal or brotherly. You can say dark or obscure. You can say Holy Spirit or Holy Ghost. And that's why he says that English is the most physical of all languages, has these two registers. Ghost is a fine, dark Saxon word, but spirit is a light Latin word. And that seems to suggest that God has granted England this English, this very interesting providential role, especially now that it's become the global lingua franca.
Yeah, absolutely. It always amuses me that English is very easy to learn the basics of, but almost impossible for foreigners to learn to a high level, just because of its complexity. If you learn Italian or Spanish, it's phonetic. So, if you can read it, you can say it. But that's certainly not the case with English. It's very much, as Ackroyd says, it's a mongrel tongue with, the core is Germanic, but as Borges says, a massive Latin overlay, which, is a nice kind of image for what the book is trying to say about England and its Latin historical culture, the Roman authority in religion. Obviously, I've heard you speak before about the pre-Roman elements as well, but clearly that was within, probably the pre-Saxon parts. I think we were talking about, maybe pre-Roman as well. What is recognisably the Catholic Church. So it's been very interesting, as we say, the last 500 years of the development of English, the English excursions. And as I talked about at the end of the book, I was very interested in V.S. Naipaul, who I thought who was one of the writers of today who compared with the writers of the past in terms of novel writing. I know he was influenced by Dickens a lot. And then I was interested to compare him to Garcia Marquez, who was obviously writing in Spanish. He has very similar things to Borges to say about English. Its power, it's so long-winded to say the same thing in Spanish, and the grammar is much more complex. He suggests, and of course that whole magical realism that is the tradition he writes in, which comes from a lot of it comes from Borges, and I think to some extent from Arabic storytelling, the Arabian Nights, and these magical stories. Mm. This is again a contrast to the English way of storytelling, which you find in Naipaul, from Trinidad, a few hundred miles along the coast of South America, from Garcia Marquez was from, and again I relate that back to the church, and I think there's some analogy in there between the way that the modern church is open to other cultures, which it should be, but the extent to which it's open through the ordinariates, through the 500 years of Protestant worship within the Church of England, and also other non-Christian cultures, and contrasting that openness with an element within the church which wants to look back and see what the church possesses, which really is where its riches come from. And if you forget that, then you really haven't got much to take forward into the other cultures.
Right. I wonder, do you think that for example, the breadth of vocabulary in the English language, which is so much vaster than many Romance languages, because of this dual origin, the other characteristics you've mentioned there, does that help to account for one of the great achievements of English literature, namely English poetry, which I think it's T.S. Eliot, he says the poetry of the unpoetic. Does that help to account for why English poetry is so significant in the Western canon?
It's a good question. I think the poetry of the unpoetic, I think that's from John Stuart Mill.
Yeah, right.
He was referring to a strain of English poetry from Wordsworth. It goes through to Philip Larkin, which is not grandiose, and it doesn't have these grand figures in it. It's very much about everyday things and the unpoetic. But the reason why poetry, it must be something to do with the language. It must be. I think to some extent it must be to do with the character of the people. More general thing to say, but to some extent. And I do also think there is that element of, if you like, classicism, of the English having a sense of the past, and a connection and a desire to continue these practices and to imitate these achievements of the past.
Yes, and I'd like to just pick up a couple of those hopeful notes that you conclude your work on. You say, quote, "While respectability and decency," you're referring here to Cowling, Alistair Cowling, who claimed that it is a low-keyed respectability which is the real religion of the English people. And then you write, "While respectability and decency may have been the modern religion of the English until the 1950s, they were a remnant of Protestant Christianity with its peculiar moral tone." So, of course, just to point out, of course, that as you also note, all societies, all states are confessional states. back to your quote, the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s saw the content of this morality, though not the tone, converted into the pieties and decencies of the new religion that has replaced Christianity as the state religion, with its politically correct revision of respectability and its pagan consequences. This is the positive aspect, the indoctrination that accompanies liberal relativism, and it is unlikely that it can be avoided without an alternative belief system, such as Roman Catholicism. You say, our literature is dead, it died with our faith, but with it died the popular anti-Catholicism which went alongside the patriotic Protestantism that was the creation of the English Reformation, an Erastian act of state supported by sectional or class interests. Protestantism has been replaced as the religion of the confessional state by a dream of neutrality and secularity, which doesn't know that it requires Christianity to exist, that it is a part of Christianity, end quote, a heretical part. And that's something that's quite noticeable, the popular conception of Catholicism. I suppose today, since the Second Vatican Council, there's confusion about what teaching of Catholicism is, but that is true to a certain extent, that there is much more of an ambiguity towards the faith among secular English people today. However, when the church starts preaching sexual morality again, I think that's liable to change. I suppose as we draw towards a conclusion, I'm interested in your final thoughts, with which you conclude your work, and also whether you might like to read one of your poems to finish our discussion.
Why don't I do that first?
Okay.
I have poems with all sorts of religious themes, but this is a simple one. It's called The Pressing. I have preserved the flowers that you gave in lines of verse as precious as the day on which you gave them. Now they are dry as the ink on paper thin on which they lay. These words will last as we and they do pass, and faith in words keeps bitter death away. Yeah, it's interesting the way you describe it, because there's kind of two shades of force that we're up against. One is very, very hostile, and one is, the way you put it, a little bit, maybe a bit more indifferent and lost, and maybe even, as I put it earlier, in despair to some extent. The world that that people have come into and that's been created around them, which has extraordinary achievements but extraordinary problems. And I think maybe you're right. I think maybe it's good for us to not to give so much time to the very hostile elements.
Mr. Thornton-Norris, thank you very much for your time. I heartily recommend your work, The Spiritual History of English, to our listeners.
Thank you, Mr. Howard.
Viva
Great
Christo.
pleasure.